Michigan. I have the great pleasure to welcome everybody to the 11th workshop on Armenian and Turkish scholarship. I want to say first thanks to the those who make this possible, Müge Göçek and Ron Suni as the organizers. Indefatigable Deacon behind the scenes was done all kinds of organizational work. We oftentimes don't have an idea of how much effort it takes. Just for instance, to get the tables into this room here. Thank you, Deacon. This is great. So this is the 11th iteration of this workshop, and Ron and Müge will give you a little bit more of the background of it. I just want to say, when I came to Michigan in 2000 as a young Ottomanist, I had this experience of Ottomanist conferences where speakers about anything related even remotely to the Armenian genocide were regularly harassed and harangued by senior scholars from Turkey. I've seen it happen that a panel that was scheduled for the conference, all of a sudden there was a sign at the door, this panel is not part of this conference. And so when I came here and I had the opportunity to sit in on the first iteration that happened at Michigan in 2002, I was floored to see that was possible. And that this level of academic discourse and this top-notch research could be exchanged and discussed across this political divide at such a level. And I'm excited that this is taking place again here. And I'm also excited to see so many younger people here in the room to see that this is continuing. So thank you all for coming. I'm very excited and looking forward to these 2 days. And now I'm turning it over to the organizers.
After this WATS, we're going to start with the Israeli-Palestinian problem. So stick around, Jack.
Yeah, you start. What? You're going to start. I'll start?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Well, I have no idea. Welcome, everybody, and thank you, Gottfried and Viken, for making this possible. Oh, yeah, we even have these little souvenirs for you. Make sure you get one. Well, this is the last one. We started in the Inshallah, yeah? What do you mean? I hope. Okay.
Also, you've said this before.
I know.
Many times, I think.
No, this is, I think, the last one, but I don't know. Well, it was, so it made me, well, there was some money left. So Ron said, what shall we do? Should I return the money? I said, no. Are you kidding me? When you have money, you have to spend it. So I said, let's get closure. Let's just have one last one. And then, finish it in Ann Arbor, as is befitting, hopefully. And then, if possible, others could just take over and continue themselves. But I was looking at the papers and how good they were for this one. And then I remembered in the year 1999, 2000, when we got together, there was literally, there wasn't anyone working on the Armenian genocide on either side, right? Neither on the Armenian side nor on the Turkish side. So we brought basically some Turkish intellectuals, liberal intellectuals from Turkey to talk about things. And then Ron did the same. And then he was so worried that we won't be able to sort of come up with a common language. And then we managed basically to come up with it. And we continued throughout. I think it has been very important in terms of having this space because of our investment in both having the senior scholars as well as the young scholars coming up through. The combination of the two, I think, kept it dynamic going forward. We also were very, very sort of flexible about the whole arrangement and made sure every time that we contextualized the Turkish-Armenian sort of conflict within a larger framework. So we had people who worked on the Russian Empire, or who worked on Circassians or Jews or other groups, Assyrians. They all sort of came, so that it was, I think, much broader in impact than it would have been otherwise. The rumor has it that, not rumor, I mean, that Obama basically learned and used Metsyegan, because we had a discussion on our listserv on Metsyegan. Instead of using Armenian genocide when he talked, I mean, because we had some people who were following what we were doing, lots of journalists, some State Department people and such. So, we had about 4,000 people at some point on the listserv. And that, I think, was very important in creating this virtual space, at least, where, of course, scholars could communicate. And I think the most significant impact and sort of reward was seeing these panels then that Armenian and Turkish scholars put together at Mesa and at other contexts. And that was very important in using, taking this forward. And we even had sort of the Azeri Armenian Reconciliation Committee even wanted to use our model as a model to sort of, get things going there. But I don't know where they're going after the Artsakh invasion. So it's very interesting to see also the reverberations throughout, also in Turkey too, but all informal, obviously. Probably the high point was 2015 or before, when we were in Istanbul. And that was the last time I was in Istanbul. I couldn't go back after that because I signed the peace petition in 2016 and got on some lists that are sort of dubious in Turkey. So that's why I've been here since then. Of course, my other thing, I mean, that this whole process led to was I wrote my Denial of Violence book during this time. And now I'm realized that after decimating the Armenians, the Turkish state then was face to face with the Kurds. And then, of course, the same violence has continued with the Kurds. So I'm now looking at the violence against the Kurds by Turkish state and society. And that's probably another reason why I can't go to Turkey, because studying Kurds is not a good idea either. So that was important. We, of course, aspired from the very beginning, at least I aspired in 2000, the year 2000. I said, well, by the time we have the centennial in 2015, hopefully we will acknowledge it in Turkey. That was like my aspiration. That didn't happen. It's just the opposite. Turkey has become more authoritarian and undemocratic. And there was like a legal coup last night. I don't know if you heard of it. The Constitutional Court and the Court of Appeals sort of went against each other. Basically, Court of Appeals did not recognize the Constitutional Court's decision. So we have at the moment a crisis in Turkey. I don't know where that's going to go, but at this point, things are so bad, it's hard to know where. In terms of recognition, of course, interestingly enough, I think Biden recognized it. So that was for us at least an important turning point, recognizing the Armenian genocide. So going forward, we hope that we are done. We want to thank all who were a part of this during these 23 years. And hopefully, the younger generation will pick up and have lots of things. We have many people now who work on this. I think the field has really developed and has become a model for how to study minorities, especially contentious ones. And maybe, I hope that you all carry the vision forward, and one day, maybe then we can have the acknowledgements. So think of us when that happens. I don't know if we'll see it ourselves. So on to you, Ron, my comrade. Yes.
And collaborator. Yeah.
Yes, and collaborate. Partner in crime, as you say, right?
Yeah. Years ago, when we planned this, I asked Müge, and I've written about this, so you probably read it. Can I go to Turkey and give a talk and about the genocide? And she said wisely, "Oh yeah, you can go. Don't worry. If anything happens, we can get you out," which was not what my mother wanted to hear at the time. But we went, and it happened, and here we are today. What I want to do in my 10 minutes, and by the way, remember that this is a workshop, and we're going to talk about 10 minutes only, and then have lots of discussion, and we'll have commentators on each panel to start the discussion. So that should work pretty well. It's hard for people because they love to talk. That's what academics do, right? We do it in 50-minute blocks, but we got 10-minute blocks today. So I'm going to try to be in 10 minutes as well. So I want to talk about the subject and why we chose this bizarre and very controversial topic, from the foundational crime to the making of a new state and nation, the end of the Ottoman Empire, and the creation of the Turkish Republic. And when we think about foundational crimes, Americans are as guilty as anyone else, apparently Canadians, Australians, New Zealanders, and Israelis as well. So this is a very vital question. We may be talking about a period about 100 years ago, but in fact, it reflects today what's going on. And the period we're looking at, roughly from the Tanzimat to the Republic, or more narrowly, 1908 to roughly, I'd say 1927, was many things at once. And I'm thinking, and what I'm going to say is both inspired by things I heard in Istanbul in a recent conference and reading the papers in the last week. So this is a period of imperial collapse, certainly, and it's the construction of a new nation state. And that's one of the most familiar kind of models that we have from empire to nation state. Hopefully we'll deepen or even challenge that. There was, of course, as Eric Zucker showed very early on in his work, a continuum from the Young Turks through the Kurtuluş Savaşı, the War of Liberation, to the Republic itself. And there were also, I would add, when I was reading the papers, ruptures as well, discontinuities, a whole series of them. So one of the threads that runs through this period was that a bunch of intellectuals, people from military schools, medical schools, etc., Young Turks and others, wanted to modernize Turkey, whatever that means, to make it more like Europe, more like the West. And this modernizing change, regrettably, was not particularly democratic. It was rather authoritarian, both in methods, almost from its beginning, and certainly once it was consolidated in Kemalism. Eventually, with the destruction of the Ottoman bourgeoisie, which of course was largely made up of minorities, Armenians, Greeks, and others, the state emerges as the only or major instrument of reform and development. So maybe it starts with 1908, because we speak of 1908. These are my thoughts, and you can share them or, confront them. We think of 1908 as a revolution, or it's called a revolution, but in fact, it was the action of about 1,500 people, military officers, urban Muslim, largely from the Ottoman Balkans and Istanbul. They were educated in those schools I mentioned, military and medical. They were products of the civil service. They were led by a Salonika-based committee that launched the coup. I think coup is a better word than revolution, in July 1908. And that change was made, it's very important, by these military officers, not by any grassroots movement, not by the rank and file, which many of them were still loyal to the Sultan. According to Zucker, though these unionists then formed the core of the political elite for the next 2 decades. So there's that theme of continuity. And they believed in a very positivistic idea of progress. That is, if we can rationally apply scientific principles, we can liberate and emancipate the Turkish people or the peoples of the Ottoman Empire. They were still empire savers rather than ethno-nationalists, but they were going to Muslimify and Turkify this empire. So the July Revolution, in some ways, marked by the loss of nerve by the Ottoman regime of Sultan Abdul Hamid II, was one to restore the Ottoman constitution, the Chamber of Representatives, and so forth, and that a minimal goal was, in fact, achieved. But bigger goals, like, and Mehmet and others will appreciate this, like dealing with the land question, of course, were never really resolved. One of the big things that I get out of studying that period and listening to, reading through the literature of that, that's now so big, right? When I started to write about, to teach Armenian history here in 1981, there was nothing to read. There was, you couldn't have written a book like They Can Live in the Desert, or many of the things you're now doing, they simply weren't, it wasn't available. So I think, as Müge mentioned, this is one of the achievements that at least WATS helped to achieve. But one of the big things was that the CUP and its members always held that political violence could be used to advance political goals. And that tradition continues into the Kemalist period. And all you have to do is read Müge's big book, Denial of Violence, and you'll find out about that. Now, this period that we're studying is followed by a cascade of transformative events, which I'll just remind you, we'll be investigating in the next 2 days. So you have in 1908 this coup or revolution, if you prefer. You have in 1909 the counter-revolution that leads to then the massacres in Adana of Armenians. You can go on through that period of political maneuvering until the 1913 January coup d'etat, another one, where a one-party dictatorship, if Hans Lucas Kieser is right, was established. Those civilians like Talat actually now dominated. The years of war, think of that, the Balkan Wars, which people like Fikret Adana has emphasized as an elementary event in shaping the attitudes that would lead to the genocide in 1911 and on. And wars start from 1911 and go on right into about 1922. So like the Russian Revolution, which I study, and the Civil War that follows, this is all against the background of enormous violence that's interstate as well as internal and intrastate. Then there's the alliance with Germany, very importantly, that occurred, and the choice made not to go with the Entente, even though Talat went to Crimea. I love that story, to talk to Sazonov, the Russian foreign minister, and they couldn't agree because the Russians insisted on the reforms of 1914. And then the decision sometime in 1915 to carry out this Armenian genocide made by a tiny small number of CUP members. Then the war and the genocide and the fleeing of the CUP leaders from Istanbul in 1918, the abortive Treaty of Sèvres, 1920, then now the beginning of this liberation movement of the Turks, of the Kemalists, the convening of the National Assembly, the 1921, the law on national political order, beginning now to form a republican constitution. The idea that now sovereignty, officially, at least rhetorically, belongs to the nation, which is represented in the National Assembly. The assembly itself takes on the royal prerogatives of the Sultan, and the Sultan for a little bit longer remains largely as a figurehead. And a colossal event, which is often not noted as significantly as it is November 2nd, 1922, the abolition of the monarchy. The Kemalists decide to be a republic, right? A nation state, but a republic, which is a radical change. When you look around Europe at the time, most countries are still monarchies. All the Baltic countries that were liberated from the Ottoman Empire became monarchies, sometimes with German princes. They're the best ones, I guess, to put, Otto or somebody, Ferdinand on the throne. And who were republics at the time in 1922? The Soviets. They were the most radical group, and the Kemalists followed this example. So this seems to me very, very important. And then we go on with 1923, of course, the 100th anniversary that is now being marked, the Declaration of the Republic of Turkey, the Lausanne Treaty, of course, which is now a whole literature is developing on that. And then, not to forget, then the turning away from the Kurds, the Kurdish rebellion, the crushing of the Kurds, the 1926 political purges, the destruction of many of the old young Turk leaders, and the move then toward a ethno-national republic with the language laws and the things that Ari and others have seen in their paper. The crushing of minority identities, including the Kurds, and what results? You know this even better than I. The influence of the military and of the use of violence as a political tool becomes embedded in Kemalism right up almost until the period of Erdogan. So you could say, and I conclude here, that the major events from 1908 to 1927 do make up, if you take the longue durée point of view, a radical revolution. Might have begun with a coup, but it becomes a kind of revolution that was deeply anti-democratic, that has to be recognized, which will influence Turkish policy to the present, despite elections and contestations of that kind, and authoritarian. And that's the legacy of the period we're studying that we're going to investigate in the next 2 days. So I'll stop there. And we'll begin by setting up the first panel with Melanie will chair. And those who are on the first panel, please come up here. And those who speak, use this mic and try to stay within your 10 minutes. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. Our topic will be.
Okay, hang on, hang on.
That's good.
So I am, I have gotten very clear instruction from Ron to keep you to 10 minutes. And I thought we actually will go chronologically. So we would start with Armin and then move to Murad, Ümit, and then Keith. And I'm also instructed to introduce you with one line. So Armin is a PhD candidate at the Department of History at Georgetown, and his dissertation is titled Imperial Horizons, Ottoman Armenians at the Twilight of Empire, 1900 to 1914. Murad Özkul is a political scientist at Istanbul University and works on railroads, has published the Hejaz Railway and the Ottoman Empire, Modernity, Industrialization, Ottoman Decline. Ümit Kurd earned his PhD in history at the Strasser Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Clark University, and he's the author of Antep 1915, Genocide and Perpetrators, and the co-author of The Spirit of the Lost, The Plunder of Wealth in the Armenian Genocide. And his newest book is The Armenians of Aintab, the Economics of Genocide in an Ottoman Province. And Keith Wattenpau is a historian and theorist of human rights and humanitarianism at UC Davis, and wrote the infamous Bread from Stones, the Middle East, and the making of modern humanitarianism, a piece of conversation for me all the time, and is now working on a book called The White Savior, The Wave, and the End of Humanitarianism, a human rights critique. I don't know if you're still doing that, but yeah, okay, but it's great. So Armin, we'll start with you. You got 10 minutes, and I'm going to hold you to it.
Thank you very much, Melanie. I promise I'm not going to take up the 10 minutes. I'll try. Thank you, everybody, for showing up today, this morning, and for taking the time to read the paper. This is a project that I've been working on for only about maybe a year or so. It doesn't really have anything to do with my dissertation. But it began, as almost all of these projects do, as just a discovery, chance discovery in working in the archives in Armenia, where I came cross references to Armenian banks and finance and diplomacy are two things which I'm very interested in. And so I just kind of started to disentangle the yarn and see how much it would yield. And what you read for this workshop is actually something that I put together just to get it in before the deadline, but I've actually expanded it a little bit as well because I've also had more chance to work with the documents that I'm working on, but hasn't substantively changed some of the findings that I've put forward in the paper. So what I wanted to do was to, when I began on this, was to write a case study on international finance and diplomacy during the war, and to kind of demonstrate the intertwined nature of the two, to look at the role of private capital in action, and to kind of move beyond these sort of large, remote, and categorical blocks of analysis like capitalism and labor when we're trying to understand the workings of the Ottoman economy. It's also attempts to highlight the transnational and the trans-imperial dimension to Ottoman and Armenian realities during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and that it becomes increasingly difficult, I would argue, to study what was going on in the empire in isolation of what was also going on in places like in Tiflis, St. Petersburg, Rostov, and Kishinev. And also looks at, one of its aims is also to look at these unrealized outcomes, or better word, unrealized futures to the Ottoman Empire. As I tried to do in my dissertation, and so also in this paper, I've always found it very useful to think about as they say, the dog that didn't bark in the night. That is, what would have the Ottoman Empire looked like had the First World War not intervened? What sort of effect would this bank project have had on the lives of the Ottoman Armenians and the other peoples of the region? And just very briefly summarize what the bank project itself was before I hand it over to my colleagues. But in early 1913, a Russian journalist visits the eastern provinces of the empire. He's a correspondent for Birzhevaya Vedomosti, which is a stock market gazette, and he writes dispatches which describe the conditions of the provinces in the east, and namely the conditions of Ottoman Armenians. And he is so, at least the way that he writes it, so appalled by the conditions that he encourages, when he comes back to Russia, Armenians to form a bank, because he views the bank as a sort of institution, not just any bank, but an Armenian bank, as he puts it, that would be able to revive the fortunes, figuratively and literally, of the Armenian peasantry, which is so impoverished in the eastern provinces. And so this is something which the Russian Armenians, who are so much more prosperous in the Russian Empire and also occupy important positions in the Russian Empire, to immediately take it up with the head of the foreign, the finance ministries in Russia, to the Russian diplomatic mission in Constantinople, and to lobby for great power support, because they feel that if we are going to be able to accomplish this, then it's not going to be done just by our own means, but Russia, which by 1913, 1914 has kind of reconciled some of its internal issues that it had with Armenians, and is now looking forward to the opportunity of also exerting its influence in the Ottoman Empire. And this is also something which the Ottoman Armenians also very much quickly grasp as well, which is something which I have not studied in too much length with the sources that I've worked at, but it's, again, very striking with the alacrity which Ottoman Armenians grasp this opportunity to pull together resources and to really build a bank which, based on my understanding, was going to easily dwarf, like, most of the other financial institutions, including the Imperial Ottoman Bank, which was a British and French financier controlled institution, and to make very important material changes based on how this bank was going to operate. I think I'll just leave it at that and, turn it over to Muna. Thank you.
As you know, this Mustafa Kemal's book is a kind of holy book for the Turkish historiography, and it commences with this important sentence. May 1919, I went to Samsun on the day, and there is, of course, a important erasure between the end of the war and this day, and two very important developments occurred during this time. One of them is the Unionist resistance. They started actually the resistance. Even we can say when they were aware they were about to lose the war, they prepared the resistance. But to some extent, this topic has been researched. But the other one, the local congresses, I think it hasn't been researched with the importance it deserves. And this is the bottom-up localism. An extension of this explanation, this sentence is important because usually people think the independence struggle was only a consequence of top-down military intervention led by Mustafa Kemal and his retinue, but it is not. It is also the consequence of the bottom-up local resistance articulating around congresses. And now this question is important. What were the motivation of both of them, the Unionists and the local congresses? And the answer is, of course, there are many reasons, but the most important dynamic is, according to us, a fear of revenge of the Armenians and Greeks with the support of the Allied powers. And these two kind of resistances were not always together, sometimes separate, sometimes like it related like three intertwined circles. For example, in some cases, the notables who had plundered the lands and property of the Greeks and Armenians spontaneously started mobilizing themselves. Sometimes they joined the Unionist-led gangs. And this is a hypothesis of us. The collective target of the Unionists and local notables was to mobilize much more against the Greeks and Armenians than the Allied powers. We gave many examples. Some of them are when the British were in Southeast Anatolia, there were no local resistance organizations. These only emerged after the French forces took over the region and supporting the Armenian bands. A similar process operated in the case of the Italian occupation of Anatolian lands. Not only was there no local resistance formed, but the notables of these occupied areas welcomed the Italians. And in addition, local notables in other regions had invited the British to come and occupy their particular regions. We can say this reality like this, these organizations took place wherever there was a possibility of the minorities returning. And this is the reason. They were, both of them, fine coexisting with the Allied forces because they thought their occupation would probably be temporary. The only problem that would and did arise concerned the possible returning of Greek, Rooms, and Armenians, and restitution of their properties, the Muslim locals, and they had plundered before. That is why they were so much keener on defending their homeland, in quotation, against the Greek, Rooms, and Armenians. And this is a kind of maybe new explanation. These local Congress governments had some really significant democratic features. But I should underline our emphasis on democracy is not about human rights. Not human rights like minority rights. It is limited within the context of political participation, for example, elections, repeated elections, and separation of powers, and civilian control of the armed forces. If you read the regulations of these local congresses, you can totally see this. And I will give only one example. There are many. This is Southwest Caucasian Provisional Government. This is one is enough for 10 minutes because almost all others operated along the same principles and organization. And these are the features of this government. As you will see, these principles indicates the first signals of the move from a multi-ethnic Ottoman Empire to a Turkish nation state. For example, I talked about the separation of powers. The National Assembly and deputies, which is Congress, they were elected, and the elections repeatedly continued. And then Heyeti Temsili is like today's Council of the Ministers. They were chosen by the members, and they had a legal system, Teşkilat-ı Esasiye Kanunu. This is the name of the Mustafa Kemal's first parliament. It is a constitution, the first constitution, we can say. And they had a flag, and they had official language, which is Turkish. And voting age was determined as 18. At measures such as replacing the term imperial subject with citizen. People were teba, subject, they became citizen, vatandaş. And controlling the appointment of dismissal of civilian governors and especially important military commanders. And they started to employ, also they changed the terminology. They started to employ such as Turk. They were Islam before. And Turkey. Turks didn't, it was Ottoman Empire for the Turks. And Türkiye, or they said Turkish states, Türk devletleri. And since the Paris Peace Conference had decided to leave the region to a proposed Armenian Republic, they changed their name and they declared themselves as independent republic. That was the first republic in Turkey before Mustafa Kemal. And on the 25th of March, just after 6 days, after 6 days, Mustafa Kemal's embarkment in Samsun. And at this stage, it gained importance how these local congresses absorbed by Mustafa Kemal, centralized parliament. Contrary to expectation, it was not easy for Mustafa Kemal to absorb this kind of local governments. They totally resisted. But the reason, yet this resistance, organizations had lacked the momentum to mobilize from the regional to the national level on their own. They couldn't continue. Because of this reason, this development greatly hindered the continuation of local mobilization, gradually leaving its local space to centralized bureaucratic organization. Nevertheless, these local governments gave the National Congress an important social base and legitimacy. Consequently, the representatives from all social classes and strata had participated in the initial assembly. This is assembly in 1920. Bottom up, making this period the most democratic in the sociological sense of mass participation in Turkish Republican history. It is worth repeating the fact that, again, the democratic structure of both kinds of organizations was not because of their ideologies. It is because of the fact that it was the only way to mobilize the society after long and exhausting wars. They needed all kinds of people, all kinds of representatives from all kinds of classes. When the war was won, this necessity disappeared. And it was designed to implement another difficult project, such as the creation of a modern state based on secular and Turkish ethnicity. That was very, very difficult. And this meant abandoning Islam, which had previously served as glue. And this transformation could only be achieved by the most Jacobin elements and methods of the modernizing cadre. This kind of modernization was only possible through the elimination of the Girondists, so to speak, and all other rivals. Regarding ethnic groups now, not only Armenians and Greeks, but also Kurds this time were on the target. Both in order to establish a nation state based just on Turkish ethnicity. The new republic then moved forward, bereft of an opposition and under the backstage control of the military, with a parliamentary democracy parading on the center stage. This is shortly our explanation.
That was great.
Oh, thank you.
Exactly 10.
Tell me. Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay. Oh, thank you.
You are up.
Yes.
Thank you very much for the organizer and for the invitation. I have been working and focusing on this idea of rupture, continuity and ruptures for a long time through the biographies of rank and file of the early Turkish Republican, especially bureaucrats rather than notoriously known people. And also through this research, I also want to understand what does this ittihadis mean? What unionist means, how they used to eat, what they used to use, and how they used to embrace this idea of political violence, resorting to resolving political problems, as Ron has beautifully pointed out as well. So I came up with the idea of genocide technocrats, and I tried to understand the role of bureaucrats and the technocrats in the making of the modern nation state mechanisms, and also their pivotal role in the destruction of the Armenians. So my project has been funded by the Kalush Gulbenkian Foundation, and it culminated in the publication of this book recently, Kanun ve Nizam Dairesi'nde, in accordance with law and order. I will translate. And the paper I also submitted will be published in Die Welt des Islams in English. I had to publish the book in Turkish because I promised to publish in Turkish to Gulbenkian. That's the reason why. So the historical actor that must be addressed in this context of the Armenian genocide is Mustafa Reşat Mimaroğlu. This is our protagonist. Can you move forward, please? Thank you so much. So as a young bureaucrat, he was the head of the Second Department of General Security, also known as the Department of Political Affairs, or Kısm Siyasi, a section of the Ministry of Interior under the jurisdiction of Talat Pasha. Along with other officers in the same unit, Mustafa Reşat played an active role in the planning, organization, and implementation of the 24th of April 1915 mass arrest in Istanbul that sparked the genocide. As such, he facilitated the decision of work of the political decision makers. He smoothly handled all the bureaucratic and administrative procedures for the execution of Talat Pasha's decision to arrest and imprison prominent figures of the Armenian community, such as politicians, political activists, and the members from the major Armenian political organizations, from the Armenian Revolutionary Federation and the Social Democrat Hunchakian Party, Ramgavars, and so forth. And then to kill them on the road between Çankırı and Ayaş in Central Anatolia. His knowledge and the command of Armenian language and the intimate relations he had developed with the Armenian community as a neighbor since his childhood in Üsküdar, and the fact that he knew the community in this way did not escape the attention of Interior Minister Talat, And Mustafa Reşat followed Armenian language newspapers and periodicals printed abroad. And when he became the head of the Kısmi Siyasi, he used his administrative and intellectual knowledge and experience to serve Talat, who was already spearheading the deportation and extermination of Armenians. As Mustafa moved up the career ladder as a local prefect, district governor, and the governor, he evolved into a genocide technocrat and put his stamp on history as the bureaucrat who carried out the roundup of Istanbul Armenian elite on 24th of April 1915. His actions were not limited to this. He undertook a direct role in the organization and execution of Talat's deportation order, especially in Karput. He traveled to Malatya and Mamaratul Aziz and witnessed the deportations on the ground and was aware of everything happening. If the deportations did not go smoothly, he was immediately sent to the scene by Talat as a trusted problem-solving technocrat. When he was the district governor of Bolu in 1917, he supervised how the deportations were organized and controlled the entire process. Also, Mustafa Reşat was personally interested in another aspect of the deportation, the fate of Armenian property and the assets. He was one of the people involved in the functioning of the abandoned property commissions established in various provinces in Asia Minor and responsible for the administration and liquidation of the movable and immovable properties belonging to deported Armenians. Spending considerable time in the organization, membership, and procedures of these commissions, he played particularly important role in the preparation of the list of Armenian entrepreneurs and merchants to be detained. After the war, he was deemed harmful to the security of Istanbul, and his arrest was regarded as necessary by the Istanbul government and the British High Commission. The major charge he faced after his arrest in 1919 was the torture of the Armenian intellectuals during their interrogations. He was also held responsible for executing the orders to send them to their deaths in Central Anatolia. His mindset was completely duty-driven. He always fulfilled his responsibilities within the boundaries of the hierarchy and obeyed his superiors. As a careerist and a modernist bureaucrat who came out of the same school of thought as Talat Pasha, his rise continued in the fledgling Turkish nation state under the Mustafa Kemal's leadership. In addition to his careerism and sense of duty, Mustafa Reşat carried out his actions around the ideal of national salvation. He was not purely bureaucratic executive without personal ideological commitment or emotional worth. As an ultranationalist and loyal and fanatic Ittihadist, he was aware that he was fulfilling a vitally important quote-unquote historical mission, saving the nation from domestic and international enemies. More importantly, he proved to Talat, the key decision maker of the genocidal operation, that he could play a facilitator role in neutralizing the Armenian elite and to be useful technocrat in the realization of the total deportation of Armenians, which required an enormous administrative and bureaucratic mechanisms. So the unionist elite, like him, had both a mystical worldview and almost worshipful embrace of science. This dual dimension was especially visible in the medical doctors of the CUP and the Kısmi Siyasi political division. Although Mustafa Reşat was not a medical doctor, he was an expert. He spoke Armenian. He had the ethnographic and technical knowledge that allowed him to master his cases and the sleuthing techniques that enabled him to create special dossiers on the hundreds of Armenian leading figures months before the massacres began. He was also familiar with the quote-unquote scientific concepts popularized by the biological materialism, biological socialism, and the social Darwinism, even if he had not read them directly from the sources. Thanks to this background and these concepts, Mustafa Reşat and his colleagues, Bedri Bey, Esat Uras, Cemal Azmi Bey, they were able to define Armenians during the CUP period and the Kurds during the Republican era as primitive, savage, bloodshed, inducing feudal ethno-classes, and the Turks as civilized and progressive superior ethno-class. Mustafa Reşat's actions within the Kısmi Siyasi were routine, ordinary daily operations that he performed without thinking the consequences. This is what was required by the organization and structure he belonged to, which had developed a kind of work ethic of its own. Therefore, in essence, Mustafa Reşat fulfilled the necessity of his duty at all costs. How many minutes do I have?
Oh, you have 7 more
Seven.
minutes.
7 minutes?
Can that be?
Not seven, but
Yes.
it's okay. You're doing beautiful.
Okay. So the institutionally constructed ethics of political division,
2 more
Kısmi
minutes.
Siyasi, so sure. The Minister of Interior superseded his own personal ethical and moral understanding. This also guaranteed that he would advance rapidly in his bureaucratic career and reach key positions. For Mustafa Reşat, sending the arrested Armenian intellectuals to their deaths on 24th of April was almost an ordinary administrative procedure within a modern bureaucratic organization. But it does not mean that he was freed from any ideological commitment or simply obeying his superior orders. On the contrary, he was quite willing and motivated to consciously implement the task assigned to him, and even felt authorized to do so. Above all, he was convinced of the righteousness of his actions. In the final analysis, he served the organization he worked for, and in this sense, Talat Pasha. He identified himself with the institution, structure, and organization he worked for, and his bureaucratic actions associated with the ideology and collective identity of this structure. So, however, this significant part of these civil military Turkish bureaucrats came from the Balkans, as in the case of Mustafa Reşat, because he came from Thessaloniki, and considered themselves as Evlad-ı Fatihan, in other words, as Turkish Junkertum. These cadres carried out the 1915 in Asia Minor, which was defined as the last homeland in the following years. They would continue their careers in the Republican era with the mission to the east, Şark Vazifesi, reaching the ranks of political notables such as deputies, ministers, and members of the administrative committee. And the historical portrait of Mustafa Reşat Mimaroğlu is not only one of the genocide technocrat, but also one of the cadres who built the bridges between the Macedonian experiences of a generation, the genocide process, and the Kurdish politics of the Turkish Republic. These cadres ensure the transfer of technology, knowledge, and ideology between these three periods and they ruled Turkey until the 1960s, when their historical time ran out. Thank you.
Great. Thank you.
Oh, sure.
If the bar
Keep
the
reading
bar
it.
is
Yeah, this is
the
very
bar
good.
is high. Everybody has been sticking to their 10 minutes.
Right.
Can you do
I
it?
have
That's the
my-
question.
Hey, there we go.
Could you show them simultaneously, please? If all possible. So just as Viken is getting set up and before I start my timer, I want to acknowledge
Oh,
and
that's
thank,
cheating.
I know, I wanted to thank Müge and Ron. I'm starting now. Did it start? Just to confirm, did you, yes. Yeah, here we go. My career traces the work of the WATS conference in many ways, right? I was one of your junior scholars once, and now I am certainly old and a senior scholar. But I just want to say how, 20 years ago when this began, how unique this gathering of humanity would be, and how now it raises barely an eyebrow, which I think is a tremendous accomplishment, actually. And going out of business is not such a bad thing because it's not as needed anymore. It's become normal. So I'm sharing two pictures, two images images I've seen like this for years, that have always, to some extent, haunted me and provoked an emotional reaction for me. On my left is an image of orphans, children whose parents had been murdered in the Armenian genocide, but also Kurdish children as well, lined up at the Ottoman Empire's sort of school at Antura that was run by Halide Edip, where they were being Turkified. And on the right is an image from Pipestone Industrial Training Arts School, which is about 824 miles that direction in Minnesota, where indigenous children, primarily from the Northern Plains, were brought to be Americanized. And the parallels between these two images have always drawn me to think about them together, but also these document the foundational crimes in the United States, the foundational crime of the United States and the foundational crime of modern Turkey, which is the transfer of children and the Turkification of indigenous people. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the accompanying paper that which has actually been published now in the Journal of Society of Armenian Studies, where I look at this, and then end with two provocations. One about what it might mean to approach the Ottoman Empire as a colonial settler state and thinking about indigenous genocide. And the second, and I write I'm a human rights studies scholar, so we lean into the public scholarship elements of our work. but a call to action to imagine ways that imagining the Armenian genocide might build bridges with other indigenous communities. So on the right is Anturas. Those of you who study the Ottoman Empire are aware that during the Armenian genocide, children were generally separated from their parents. Children were seen as very valuable. Work done by Muge and Mumit and Nazam Maksudian could also document how they were viewed as a way to transfer wealth between the Armenian population and the genocidaire population. In this case, in a kind of experiment that was undertaken by the ultra-nationalist Turkish feminist Halide Edip, later Adevar, these children were brought to this beautiful old convent school in north of Beirut, where they experienced education that was actually fairly good, but also a radical Turkification, where if they spoke the Armenian language, if they used their Armenian names, they were beaten severely, and also where ultimately they were victims of the Great Syrian Famine and had to resort to anthropophagy to stay alive. We know a lot about this orphanage because there are three firsthand accounts of young people who were incarcerated there. The most famous being Karnik Panian, whose memoir I had the privilege of helping bring to an English-speaking audience. There are also two oral histories as well that have been collected since. In addition, Halide Edip writes and justifies her role in committing genocide through this institution in her memoir as well. You've written about it, I've written about it, others have written about it. It's very important to us. Now, what's of course important is that we know about the orphanage in Beirut because it was liberated in the course of the First World War, and Armenian Red Cross officials and others working with Near East Relief were able to take possession of the children. Orphanages like this were ubiquitous throughout the empire and transferred many thousands and thousands of children. We just don't know yet a lot about them. On the right is Pipestone Industrial Training Arts School. This is from the 1890s. We know a great deal about this also because of a memoir written by one of its inmates, a guy named by the name, now he's still alive actually, Adam Fortunate Eagle, who is from Minnesota and had a very interesting life as an urban Indian in the East Bay. He was one of the organizers of the great Indians of all nations occupation of Alcatraz about 50 years ago. And he writes as well about it. So what I did in this paper, which is probably about 20 pages too long, frankly, it's 33 pages long, explore all sorts of things in it, is I took the two memoirs of Panian and Fortunate Eagle as a point of departure. Because one of the things that's very important to me in scholarship on institutions like this is that we can really be lulled into a sense of I think the archives of empire are so persuasive that we want to follow them. And I thought that whenever we talk about these kinds of situations, that we need to begin from the memoirs of those who inhabited. So the thesis that I came up with after looking and trying to compare these two, I mean, one is, I know that Halide Edip's ideas were not original, and other scholars have pointed this out. And I was always very interested in the connection, if there was a way to draw a straight line between what was happening on the right and what was happening in the Ottoman Empire. I'm still not satisfied that I've been able to demonstrate that, but I do know that people like Halide Edip were really deeply enmeshed in the kind of scholarship and social scientific knowledge that was being produced in the United States about justifying the incarceration of young people. And the thesis that I've come up with, though, out of this is that carceral humanitarianism, which is what I call this kind of practice, is really at the core of all modern genocides. In fact, it's even definitive of modern genocide. So let me just pause there. You have the paper is there to read. I know my friends at the Journal of Society of Armenian Studies would really like people to read their articles because apparently no one does. Yeah, it's really hard. No, it doesn't get shared very well. Yeah, the two provocations are this. One, I've been arguing that the Armenian genocide was indigenous genocide. It was an indigenous genocide. And it bears much more in common with the genocides of other indigenous people around the world than it does the Holocaust, right? But that also means something else for Ottoman studies, which is that this is an indigenous genocide. That means that the Ottoman Empire is a colonial settler state, right? So I think that this and Chris Gratian and others, Sam and others, have really used some of these ideas. I think much of late Ottoman history makes a lot more sense if you think about it as a colonial settler state. And even contemporary Turkish policy makes sense if you think about modern Turkey as an inheritor of a colonial settler state. Colonial settler states like to help other colonial settler states. Think about the United States and Israel right now, right? So that's one thing I would invite people here to think about, is beginning to shift our vocabulary and our methodology into imagining the Ottoman Empire as just that, a colonial settler empire. The second is about 3 or 4 years ago, right before the pandemic, or no, actually not, Deb Haaland, who's the American Secretary of the Interior, went to Carlisle boarding school, stood beside these graves where these little Sioux children were being disinterred and were going to be brought home to their homeland. And she said, it's a very evocative quote, and I think it was just spur at the moment. And she said, that cultural genocide didn't work. We're still here, right? And of course, that's a wonderful thing to say, and the passion, the emotion is there, but she was wrong. The cultural genocide did work, right? And so I've often thought of that as an invitation for conversation. Those of us who've been engaged in Armenian studies for our lives, and we're now like, we've got this enormous body of knowledge and experience and understanding also about how to engage in political action. I think that Native American communities and activists and scholars are really eager to share that, and especially share that experience, especially through discussions around the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So I'm asking us as well to consider ways that we could build those bridges through scholarship, like we've already done with WATS and so on, comparative conferences around some of these issues as well. So I'm going to end there, and I'm going to be short. And I didn't cough the whole time. I'm so proud of myself.
If you pass that to me.
Yes.
Okay, so I've prepared some remarks, and I hope that they're no longer than 10 minutes. You never know. So fabulous work. I was really happy to read these papers, and it's also nice to see these papers setting the tone of the conference. And I guess we're in some ways revisiting some of the discussions that have really also dominated the Ottoman and Turkish history field, but also rethinking some of it. I want to say the title of the panel, I think, is a bit misleading, and maybe I don't know what from reform to revolution, and we're maybe as chronological markers, but then also, as Ron already said, maybe the revolution was not a sudden revolution, but one that was drawn out. And reforms are, where are they? They have failed. The paper that set the stage for the discussion of reforms is Manuk's paper outlining the struggle or attempt to forge an international financial collaboration which would realize the establishment of a national Ottoman Armenian bank in the eastern provinces. The story is one of eventual failure, but it's also such a fascinating story. I've never heard of this. And it's a disappointment, as of course the realization of the bank fell victim to the onset of the First World War and the genocide and the expulsions of Armenians. So less reform, but I guess more failure. My question for Manuk is, the conversation around this bank takes place at an important moment when the international community, also a failed attempt, was negotiating and eventually signing the Armenian Reform Act in February of 1914. And you mentioned this Reform Act in your paper, but I wonder if you could in your comments, expand a little bit how the bank fits into that larger negotiation that's besides the Russians, of course, also included other actors like the Germans, and Lepsius, I think, was involved as well, Johannes Lepsius. The paper of Murat and Müge, which marks the periodical endpoint, I guess, of the panel, we might all agree also that it's less about revolution by definition. I'm a little confused about just while you were presenting about the first constitution, the first parliament, depends on how we look at it, right? If we think of continuities, it may not be so easy to say that, or sort of a democratic attempt, where democratic attempts seem to have been the story of the late 19th century and early 20th century in the Ottoman Empire already. But rather, the paper also argues, I guess, for continuity. So this, I think, will probably be a lot of our conversation on unionist power. And although it was receding, the authors write, the unionist political power remained in effect, especially on the road leading to the establishment of the Turkish Republic until at least 1926. As the authors contend, there are some overlooked continuities that you so beautifully outlined in your paper and also in your presentation here, as the continuities between the unionist and the Kemalist state had already been well established in the literature, as Ron already mentioned in his opening remark. But the ignored factors here were the unionist initiation, funding, and fighting in the resistance that was sort of a very ground up local resistance that predated, of course, Mustafa Kemal's arrival. My question for you both is, so the local resistance and the unionists funding and fighting is somewhat of a grassroots attempt to maintain power. And I'm not sure if we can say that. The paper ends with a hint at an economic continuity as well, which was the top-down creation of a Turkish bourgeoisie. And I'm curious to hear a bit more about this. I've read about it in the context of unionist government policies, but what are the similarities of these policies of economic continuity with the Republic's policy during the time of transition and after? In general, all these papers intend to challenge or contribute to a well-established literature that over the 2 decades now, and much due to this venue of WATS that has pushed against national historiography, which has systematically engaged in the erasure of the unflattering founding history or the foundational, with an emphasis on the foundational crime. Murat and Müge argue that the crux lies in uncovering the details of the tumultuous period between the armistice of Mudros and Mustafa Kemal's arrival in 1919, which I've already mentioned, broadcasts a sort of stubborn political continuity of the unionist and local resistance committees, and Ümit Kürt takes it to the individual and outlines the persistence of a mindset that challenges really the myth of a democratic beginning. And the continuities of in the governing leaderships are embodied also in the figure of Mustafa Reşat. And it's so nice to see that memoirs, and both of you are working with memoirs, can give us a completely new kind of view into what we've been doing. But Mustafa Reşat not only rose through the bureaucratic ranks to become what you call, or what I'm going to make you say, I'm going to put words into your mouth, the Ottoman Eichmann. But also continue.
No, it was in the paper.
But also continued his career as an important member of the Republican government into the 1940s. This despite the fact that he had been exiled to Malta at the end of the war and was clearly marked as a member of the political body that had committed genocide. What is exemplary here in Kürt's paper, based on the memoirs of Mustafa Reşat, is that continuities were not only the personnel, but made the transition into this new regime, but also were deeply rooted in a particular mentality. Indeed, the memoirs of Reşat expose the continuity of a civilizational discourse embedded in what Kürt distills to an economic reductionist, centralized, modernist, and statist mindset, very beautifully said. Rishad embodied and represented in his position and in his conviction this dominant paradigm of the state, which did not change in its ascent with the end of the empire. Instead, as Kurt argues, the Kurdish issues and state policies from the 1920s onward resembles those formulated and carried out by Rishad in the name of his state. In the case of Armenians, it meant deportation and extermination, and in the Kurdish case, violence, suppression, oppression, denial, and assimilation. Keith takes an innovative approach that challenges also, of course, nationalist history by recasting the Ottoman and Turkish state as a settler colonial entity. This framing allows for the exposure of the historically violent treatment of the states, this repertoire of oppression and settler colonialism in regards not only to Armenians, but also other indigenous populations who inhabit the empire. The violent logic of the settler colonial state undermines narratives of the Ottoman Empire as a benign non-colonial entity where intolerance defined a multi-ethnic space, and those narratives, of course, that insist on a primordial Turkishness in Anatolia. Moreover, Keith writes, thinking about the genocide of the Armenians in the frame of indigenous genocide can recast the period of 1915 to 1922 as an intensification of genocide rather than a de novo act. This argument of intensification fosters a reconsideration of the overarching role of nationalism in ideologies of extermination, and so yet another continuity. Both Keith and Ümit's paper in particular open new avenues in how we place the Armenian genocide into dialogue with the broader field of genocide studies. Kurt's paper draws on the well-rehearsed and long-standing literature inspired by the Holocaust and positions genocide to be a modern state project by focusing on the technocrat, the desk murderer, the banal servant of evil. Max Weber wrote about the bureaucrat, I quote, "The hour of the civil servant is vested in his ability to execute conscientiously the orders of the superior, exactly as if the orders agreed with his own conviction. This holds even if the order seems wrong to him and if, despite the civil servant's remonstrates, the authority insists on the order. This kind of behavior means for a civil servant moral discipline and self-denial in the highest sense, through honor of discipline, is substituted by moral responsibility." It seems to me that Rishad was all too willing when it came to following orders, as he absorbed and eventually espoused the regime's narrative of Armenians as disloyal traitors, a belief that outlived his arrest and was carried into the times of the Republic. And when he began writing his memoir, which, as we saw in detail, chronicled the nationalist activities of Armenians. And like Eichmann, excused himself as just following orders, while at the same time being convinced of the value and necessity of the action. Indeed, his perceived moral responsibility mapped onto honor, as it was his obligation to contribute to saving the nation, a willingness to partake. The work of Zygmunt Bauman has long been stable in linking modernity or bureaucratic modernity and genocide. And it might be interesting to engage in some of the points he makes about how bureaucracy as an expression of the modern state facilitated mass participation. For instance, he writes, "The bureaucrat, the increase in physical and or psychic distance between the act and its consequence, achieves more in the suspension of the moral inhibition. It quashed the moral significance of the act and thereby preempts all conflict between the personal standard and moral decency." It's all about distance. So my question for Ümit, I think this does not reply to or apply to Rishad, and maybe you could draw out some of the nuances for us when you are thinking about the broader context of German civil servants serving the Nazi regime and the overall broader structure of the Ottoman context of what does it mean to be working in the administration more generally. My question is, what is in the end helpful beyond the similarity of the two individuals, as perhaps the context will actually lead you further down a rabbit hole to understand the role of modern governing practices and genocide. And I'm almost done. Keith moves the needle into thinking beyond the frame that is set by the Holocaust by thinking about the Armenian genocide in conversation with indigenous genocide, which encompasses attacks on language, culture, heritage, religion, and non-European forms of political organization. And he notes that this inherently complex nature means that indigenous genocide do not really fit well into academic definitions and have actually been for decades ignored as being conversation points in the field. Placing the history of Armenians as indigenous people clearly presents possibilities of re-engagement with critical gaps in the theory of genocide. And you beautifully articulate that by thinking about undoing this artificial distinction between genocide and cultural genocide. I appreciate your critique of humanitarianism. I love it, and its practices and forms, to not being immune from being employed as an adjunct to genocide under certain circumstances. And so one aspect, and of course this paper is published, and if I would have read it before, I would have asked you to deploy Halide deep more. I want to hear what she has to say. You know, what is, I know it's there, but you know, what is that humanitarian discourse and that she draws on? And Aintura, no doubt, is one example of this carceral humanitarian, which has also been deployed in the context of refugees and refugee camps. But I'm super intrigued, and I'm going to steal this.
Yeah,
you know that.
All you have to do is footnote it. You're not stealing.
But I've already like written a paper in my head about it now. But how do we think of this carceral humanitarian culture, language, in what we oftentimes think of these benign spaces, like the rescue houses, Yepes widow colony? The same critique, can it apply there? And how would you place it into conversation? And maybe we have to write that paper together. So those are my comments. And thank you so much for your great papers and your great work. So, Manu, I'm gonna hold you on this now. You're gonna, oh, sorry, Armin. I'm sorry. I'm gonna hold you to it. So tell us about the Armenian Reform Act and what is the context? Sorry.
Yeah, so again, it's something which I think I may need to think about a little bit more, but the Armenian Reform Act was discussed so much, I think, in the earlier historiography on diplomacy in the Ottoman Empire, that I think it's really requires like another new look at it, especially when I come to, I mean, it seems like as if it's one of these signposts to the lead up to the First World War, or in the histories of the Armenian genocide, just the lead up to, always serves as a prelude to the Armenian genocide. The reforms themselves talked about, I guess we would consider like more mundane things, like appointing more Christians in local government positions in the eastern provinces, in the gendarmerie, the big administrative division, with the eastern provinces becoming two inspectors governates, and abolishing or at the very least reducing the power of the Sharia courts. Whereas, again, it's very interesting when you look at what contemporaries were also talking about, especially from the perspective of Armenian businessmen in Russia. So of course there's this article which kind of prompts them to ring the alarm bell and think that, as the Russian journalist calls his article series, Vanishing Armenia. But the 8 February 1914 agreement seems to offer, at the very least, like a political and legal means of legitimating further investments or involvement in the eastern provinces. So as these meetings take place in the spring of 1914, you can see the sense of excitement and elation that Russian and Ottoman Armenian businessmen are evincing for what this sort of bank would be able to accomplish. So they talk about a lot of cultural work, and that I think is meant to refer to, for example, schools and sponsorship of different kinds of programs for the local populations. Of course, loans which are offered to Armenians in the to peasants would be made on much more favorable terms than if they were to get it from, say, a different bank. So all of these, I think, were meant to signify the sort of renaissance that may have, again, had the war not taken place, had the great powers been able to exert their pressure and their, quote unquote, rights according to, let's say, the capitulations agreements, they may have been able to. I mean, I think it's very tantalizing to think like what sort of changes could have come about had there been this sort of gradual level of influence. One thing which I maybe just want to throw out a question to other people, but it's also something which I didn't have a chance to explore much in length, but it was also what the Ottoman government thought about a lot of, this kind of project. The Russian journalist, actually his trip was cut short in the provinces because he got an order from the Interior Ministry telling him that we're expelling you for spreading anti-Turkish propaganda. And it was only a week later that he gave this big speech in Tiflis at the time. So that's just one question which I'd be very interested in. I'm interested in exploring in length. And also another question is like, how does this fit within larger narratives about the history of the late Ottoman economy, how the genocide itself devastated on Armenian material and capital, and why there could never be sort of resuscitation after that. Anyways, I'll just leave it at that. Thank you.
I want to say about the economic continuity a few sentences. The Turkish bourgeoisie didn't emerge. It continued to emerge during the Republican time. It started under the control of the Unionists. This Talat Enver decided to employ in Turkish Milli İktisat Politikası. It is a national economic policy, and they wanted to employ the variant of capitalism, not liberal one, the German style, German historical school. According to German historical school, they increased the import taxes, and they established new Turkish Muslim institutions and banks, especially important banks, and they gave concessions to people. For example, there was a railway from Istanbul to Ankara. If you give a concession to somebody who is ihtiyacist, in 15 days, he became rich. This is the capital accumulation. And because of this reason, these local congresses established and continued to fight, because before Talat escaped to Germany, he ordered his friends that they continued to fight with the organizations Karakol, Black Karakol. It was an secret organization, and they employed the genocide also. They continued. They hid the weapons in some lands, and they continued with these Karakol organizations, and these notables became rich during the war because of this policy. And the Mustafa Kemal government continued this policy. Exactly the points are the same. Establishing establishing a bourgeoisie not from bottom up, top down, with state help, state support is an important concept. What was another question? Maybe Müge wants to answer. Do you have another question?
No, I'm gonna leave it open for others, but then maybe we'll
Okay.
move to Ümit.
Yeah, let me address it. Thank you so much. This priceless feedback in the first place. If you send me your feedback through email, I will be delighted. So yes,
Thanks.
thanks. So yes, actually, in the very beginning of the article and also in the book, I came up with this story of Ayman, which took and Ayman, as you know, he was arrested he was kidnapped and arrested, brought to Jerusalem for trial in 1961. Hannah Arendt was there, but when he was not realized or noticed by the Nuremberg judges until 1945. In one of the trials, one of the American judges, he just, cast an eye on one of the papers and evidences, and he saw this name, Ayman all the time. So he said, who is this guy? Who's Ayman? Until April 1945, his name, he was a very, very highly notoriously known Nazi bureaucrat, and he was responsible for approving or picking up the for Jewish deportees to send to death camps, and he said, okay, send them. So he was basically having the weight of Heinrich, but he was not all around, unlike Heinrich and other Himmler too. So for the first time in 1945, his name was mentioned, and after a year, Mustafa Reşat Mimaroğlu published his memoirs in 1946. His memoirs was published. I have no idea whether or not he was aware of the trial. He was aware of Ayman. I don't know. I haven't bumped into any information about that. So, and after 16 years, the Ayman trial happened. With regards to organizational culture or the same pattern can be discerned in the Nazi bureaucracy or the CUP. I think these two political parties and entities, they were so heterogeneous. Even the Nazis were very, very heterogeneous and very loose organization. And I think that was the key point, to hold all these different people under the same umbrella. It was the same in the case of CUP. Imagine Ziya Gökalp and Ürgüplü Hayri Bey, they hate each other, but they were members of the Central Committee and they worked together for the same purpose. Yeah. So for the same ideal, the national salvation, serving the nation, serving the people. They staunchly, firmly believe that they came into existence with this mission, as Sheriff Martin always pointed out. Of course, there are similarities, discernible similarities between these two personas, I would say, but we should be really cautious to make these, as well. But the most distinguishing common joint pattern between these two guys, they develop a kind of certain organizational culture and work ethic, which they really, really stick to it. Yeah. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they were waived from any kind of ideological, organizational, or effective disposition or emotional work. They had a huge ideological commitment to this common purpose, but also they were technocrats. They were cogs in this destruction wheel, and their definition of their duties were so blatant, and they knew that there was no way to diverge from that point, no way to get lost in this sense. Also, it was a clear path for them to prove their serviceability, to climb to the higher echelons of the state bureaucracy. It was a really, really fertile ground for their own career and their own future. By the way, Reşat became the head of the Court of Appeal in 1932. Yeah, he was Mason, by the way. He was a member of Mason, and Mustafa Kemal specifically asked him to quit from this masonry. Otherwise, he wouldn't have been able to assign as Court of Appeal, the head of the Court of Appeal. And he served after he retired in 1939, and then he served Izmir deputy in the parliament, and then he served the head of the Republican People's Party Istanbul Administrative Council, and after that he became the member of the Agricultural Bank board member. Why am I giving all this information? This is exactly the pattern of the same rank and file guy, that I can give you a number of technocrats, bureaucrats like him who follow exactly the same path, the same career path. That was it for now.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Where,
So,
oh, sorry.
You need that?
Actually, no,
Okay.
no, maybe we'll just go to Keith and then I have something more to say.
So what I thought I wanted to do right now is see if I can draw some
Yes.
lines between what you're working on and what I've done here. So first, I went to sleep thinking about your paper actually, which is a good sign.
It
Good
put you to
sign.
sleep.
No. I couldn't stop thinking about it. So there's all these, so Eichmann is actually the German Mimaro, right? So we should do, that's chronological. correct. Yes, he's the Ottoman Eichmann. But so I think just a couple points up front. I think that your positions very interestingly, bring in the Baumann, bring in the Arendt, bring in the Weber, but also recognize that there's a possibility here to think about the legacies and strains of Ottoman bureaucracy and
Yes.
bureaucratic that is not necessarily the case for the German experience, right? The other is this remarkably strange parallel, which I don't think, when you really think it was not that strange. I didn't know this about until you told me. Mimaro looked like grew up with Armenians, right?
Yes.
So little known fact of Eichmann, he taught himself Hebrew. He was like really into Jewish history. I mean, he was the head of Jewish affairs, right? That was his job up to the time of the Wannsee conference.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think that the other thing is this is a kind of paper that can cross over because of the European element in it, right? But I think that I think you can get somewhere better than Die Welt der Islams. No offense to anyone. Where you are actually you're being able to theorize genocide bureaucracy, but also its local variations, right? Because as Muguet likes to say, the Ottoman Empire had the longest continuous bureaucracy in history.
But it's dismissed, right? I mean, it's it's not seen as like this modern state in the literature of the genocide. It's not
Right,
seen
that's
as the
right.
modern state apparatus that has cogs and
Right.
in the wheel.
This is where
right?
Umi could
where-
maybe
yeah.
right where Umi could maybe explain that transition, because maybe these young Turk bureaucrats also had a very negative view of Ottoman bureaucracy, but on the other hand, that's where they came from, right? So I think there's a wealth of opportunity here, and anytime that there's these systems, this is what and parallels that seem they seem too coincidental to be accidental, right? Okay, so that's the thing about the boarding school movement. It's a global movement, right? So it's too coincidental to be accidental. And so one thing that's always interested me, and I think that we just need to do a lot of more work on, is we tend to think about, especially, I'm also writing a book right now about thought, refugee thought, and is that we always imagine people in the Middle East are so disconnected intellectually from what's going on, and a lot of our work confronts it. I confronted that in my first book as well. And so, but I think we need to do a better job placing them at places. So an interesting observation to make is, the quote in my title is, kill the Indian in him and save the man, right? Well, that was delivered as part of an academic paper. That's where the origin of that comment is actually a director of one of these schools going to a conference in Denver and speaking to a global audience of humanitarians, right? And so, that's the kind of connection I want to make. With Holiday Adib, it has a lot to do with the settlement houses and so on. And just like with these bureaucrats, is that they're aware of best practices, ideas, they're in conversation.
And they create a culture.
Right, that's right. There's kind of a cult, but I think it's a more globalized culture than we tend to imagine, right? And so, and we know this from Stefan Ehrig too, is like they're reading and watching each other, right? So even your observation that he doesn't publish his memoir till after 46, maybe there's something to that, right?
Yeah.
So I think that this is a really, it's important too, because these bureaucratic cultures of carceral humanitarianism, genocide, that they're not so far removed from everyday bureaucratic cultures. In other words, that's like Baumann's idea and Arndt's idea, they can always tip into it. And we live in these cultures today. That's the important part, right? is that we continue to exist in these kinds of bureaucratic cultures where genocide, mass extermination, destruction of indigenous peoples are all conceivable as in today, right? So we I think in our now we need to understand these origins, and also because bureaucracies, they feel so permanent, and they really are. They just don't change. So I think I think you could get this in the AHR or something like that. If you
already done.
no, you write a new one. No, you can write a variation on it.
Yeah,
Be confident.
it's
Mike again.
Yeah.
okay, like
You can hold it, yeah.
what's fascinating about also this guy is even in early 20s, he really formed and constituted main contours of denialism, genocide denialism.
Yeah.
When you look at his memoir, there's a particular chapter dedicated to explaining the Armenian history within the Ottoman Empire, and every single information regarding the Tanzimat, its reflections. Even before Antaramyan, he talks about the reflections of Tanzimat in provinces and so forth within the Armenian community and so forth. All these details, as if I'm speaking, I'm having dialogue with an ethnographer. You know, every single information he collected, and he prepared reports, lahia, and he submit and dispatched these lahias to Minister of Interior. What we glean from this memoir and the information in his memoir, that I think the first Turkish official denialist historiography was carved out by this guy, and Esatras followed him because they were colleagues in the second division of Minister of Interior together, and both Esat and Reşat, since they knew Armenian, they interrogated Armenian intellectuals. They interrogated Avedis Nakashian, for instance, and Savaş Misakyan, for instance. Mustafa Reşat was there when Savaş Misakyan was being tortured physically. He was there. So he even criticized the Talat Pasha's, the memo, what Talat Pasha said in his memoirs, that, you know, he wasn't giving the clear-cut information about the Armenian question, actually. He didn't even find enough of the Talat Pasha's explanations. Also, regarding the Kurdish Eastern question, this guy was sent to Eastern provinces in 1922, 1923, even before the announcement of Turkish Republic. He set his foot every single district, town, and province of the Western Armenia, and also Gilicia. Then he prepared reports, again, very rich reports he sent to the Minister of Interior. Again, you see the state policies which were applied to these regions came from his own, based on his own reports. Yeah.
So we should open it to people for questions. So if you have a question.
You have to pass the.
We had another mic, a hand mic. We should give a hand mic for later. Okay. Can we get one or no? Why? Really? Bizarre.
Thanks so much for all these papers. I had a quick comment for Keith and then a question for Umit. For Keith, I mean, I thought this was really powerful and such a useful provocation. I'm also curious of I mean, the photo, for example, we can see the likeness in it. But the other thing I'm thinking about is people are constantly talking, like, actually very directly about these connections. So the thing I have in mind is Talat Pasha telling Morgenthau, we're going to treat the Armenians like we do African Americans, and Morgenthau says in his memoir, I think he means like the Indians, right?
Bryce.
Woodrow, I mean, going a different way, Woodrow Wilson says the Turks are like Mohammedan Apaches. And so Perrin Gurel's work is really good on this. The first chapter of her book is really well done, mapping out some of these kind of incoherent comparisons. But
well, actually, one of the very first, I'm going to yell so that people on the mic can hear it. One of the very first times I ever thought about the parallels, probably in the 1990s, as I was reading the Rescue House narratives. Mm-hmm. And they seemed a lot like the captivity narratives that were very popular in the United States in the very beginning of the 19th century, the early 20th century. This is where European American settler women were kidnapped And then they lived with indigenous communities for a while, and they came out, and they all follow a very similar, interesting format, but they're very similar, but also they were both collected by missionaries.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
And some of these missionaries are moving back and forth.
that's right.
Announce who you are.
Sorry, I'm Sam Dolby.
That's,
Um,
Oh, I think. And everybody should do that before they talk.
yeah, sorry about that. I was so excited to ask questions. And then for Umit, this is kind of picking up on the conversation about Eichmann. I wanted to know more about these really strange, intimate things that are going on with Mimarolu. I mean, learning a language is hard. How many Ittihadis spoke Armenian? Who ethnography, it takes time. It requires talking with a lot of people. And so something that I was struck by in your work is this really powerful line at the end where he says, I'm just a civil servant. But he says that in his memoir decades after the fact. And I'm wondering, like, to what extent is that an alibi? And to what extent is he actually papering over? I mean, it's really hard for you to say because of the source base, right? But I wonder if the framing of him as just a civil servant who has good work-life balance and he just forgets about everything when he goes home and doesn't actually care about this, he's just following orders. I wonder if that's actually not true, and that if there's something actually more profound and evil going on, given what it means to learn a language.
So Gottfried has a question, and then we'll go down the line here.
So, thank you. There's a lot to think through, I'm willing at some point to actually take Keith's provocation and be the one who's being provoked.
Okay.
Get into the argument about the usefulness of settler colonialism. But right now, I just want to sort of take the discussion about the Ottoman Eichmann a little bit further, because I'm also struck how Eichmann has become sort of this singularly example of that, into which we sort of project all kinds of bureaucratic ideals that may not always be sort of the best example of that. And so I want to offer you sort of a different comparison, which would be Albert Speer, as one of the leading technocrats. Because after all, also, let's keep in mind that Eichmann's career was cut short with the end of World War II. And so we know him as the bureaucrat of the genocide. But this guy continued, and he was willing to write a memoir that took in all of his career into the higher ranks. And that leads me to the second part of the question. How do you go about reading a memoir sort of 30 years after the fact, and with a sort of long trajectory of a career? How is there a way for you to sort of unpack how he subsumes what he did 30 years before into that long chronology and ultimately teleology of his own life? Is there a way of distinguishing how he makes sense of his acts 30 years later and how those acts actually came about? Which I'm sure, I mean, I'm not a theoretician of bureaucracy, but I'm sure there's a significant amount of just opportunism that goes into it, and that tends to get filtered out once you let the perpetrator actually control the narrative. How do you do that? I'll leave it at that.
So should we let you answer and then we go this way? Otherwise it will become too many questions to keep in mind.
Okay. Thank you, Sam, for these great questions. Actually, a great number of Ittihadis knew Armenian, I would say. By the way, we are talking about people from the graduates of the Imperial School of Political Science, Mülkiye. And you know, the Armenian was one of the elective courses, along with the Persian, Greek, and so forth. For instance, let me give you a very intriguing information about Mustafa Reşat. He learned Armenian by taking private tutors from Dikran Kelekyan, because Dikran Kelekyan was his professor in in the Mülkiye. So, and he was the one who prepared the arrest file of Tigran Kelekyan as well. And in his memoir, he explains why he arrested Tigran Kelekyan specifically. You know, even though in the hindsight, I learned this information. He was the student of Tigran Kelekyan, and then I realized he explained specifically why he arrested Tigran Kelekyan rather than other Armenian intellectuals. So Esat Uras knew Armenian, and Cemal Azmi Bey knew Armenian, Kara Kemal knew Armenian, and I can continue. But he also, when he was living in Thessaloniki when he was a kid, he was surrounded by some Armenian families as well in Thessaloniki. But in Üsküdar, it was very, very immense with the culture and with the families and his play peers and so forth. And so he was he a simple cog in the whole machine? No, he wasn't. Of course, he was a staunch unionist, but his unionism was distinctly different from the unionism in Kara Kemal, the unionism in Bahattin Shakir, or unionism in Dr. Nazım, because this guy in the first place was a bureaucrat, and he wasn't a member of the Central Committee, he wasn't a member of the İttihat ve Terakki Merkez Komitesi, but he was so obsessed with becoming a district governor, So immediately aftermath of the Young Turk Revolution, the first act he did was to become a member of CUP club in Istanbul, in Beylerbeyi CUP club. And when he was hired by Talat in the second division in the Ministry of Interior, Kara Kemal vouched for him. So because he was kind of he was kind of in a limbo situation, but Kara Kemal cleared the mind of Talat and made sure he could be a good servant, he could be good, bureaucrat, and he could be beneficial. But in the first place, I wouldn't say that he did breed an Armenian animosity specifically, particularly, but he also firmly believed and stick to the policy of CUP towards Armenians. He believed that deportation was a necessity. He believed that destruction was necessity. He believed that these people and Anatolia was supposed to be Turkified and the homeland for Turks and so forth. All these ideological meta-narrative, he was stick to it. In that sense, he had this kind of ideological commitments, I would say. But I wouldn't say that he was staunchly anti-Armenianist and as such. Yeah.
Yeah, I think Armin, you say something.
Okay. I want to address the question.
Kind of adds to it. Kind of to bounce on what Sam was saying too. I mean, just like I do wonder, it's like does having knowledge of a certain language, like in this very particular context, or like Eichmann knowing German necessarily lead them to what we now consider like the wrong conclusions. I remember this HBO documentary that they made of the Wannsee conference. There was Conspiracy is fantastic, which goes by the entire transcript of the conference. There's a Dr. Wilhelm Stukat, who's the Third Reich's Interior Ministry Secretary, and he tells the people at all the attendees that we should be treating the Jews as very seriously as a threat, that we kind of make fun of them, like in the same way that Goebbels presents them as these sort of caricatures and propaganda, but he and others are really are taken in, or he argues that we should be taking them in as truly people who are conspiring to destroy the Germany and have much more nefarious plans for the world. And I do wonder if people like Mimarol is also, even though they may know the Armenian of it, and even though they may have kind of grown up in that sort of in that neighborhood and raised in it, I wonder if like all that kind of once 1915 kind of rolls around, they also have this sort of caricatured idea of what our Armenians are, because it just leads them so easily to justify what they do without any need to sort of offer any reflection, whether it's at the time or in their memoir. Maybe if that might be something which.
Should we go to you maybe?
Sorry about that.
Yeah, thank you to everyone for sharing these papers. And I also thought that there was this maybe another this other thread running through the presentation, this top-down versus bottom-up, like the change. How do we understand change? And I had this question for Keith. I thought that it was this idea of like you just you know, like almost like salvaging universalism from Eurocentrism, which is, you know, like as Susan Buckmore says. I thought that in that sense, you know, the usage of the use of indigeneity as a framework is very meaningful. But I have a question about this, and I have comment, have question, but it's not a critique of your work. I'm curious about how you understand indigeneity. But I'm also curious about you know, the ways in which we can approach the idea of indigeneity. You know, I don't know if you're familiar with Nandita Sharma's work, you know, about the post-colonial world order and its separation of people into people out of place and people in place. So I think about this this idea a lot, to be honest. And so I am wondering about how we can approach indigeneity, or like this idea of, or how not to perpetuate, I guess, this idea of belonging to a place as opposed to having a relationship with a place. Because like in indigenous studies, for instance, I feel like there's this discussion is, you know, like that's been running on for quite a while about how not to reduce these issues to just land claims and, you know, an essentialist understanding of culture. Yeah, so I'm wondering about how, yeah, is nativeness in itself a problematic idea? Like, could it be? And if, you know, or maybe there may be a way to refer to that, the basic reality that indigeneity presents, because it's not just a construct, it does refer to a reality without reproducing the ontological categories of the nation state. And I'm also wondering if this idea, you know, like the way that indigenous people talk about this connection to land in terms of like being caretakers of the land, like is that like perhaps an idea that you're drawn to not conceptualize land just as territory, or how do we avoid that, basically? Thank you.
Give your name, just because a lot
Of course, yeah, Jeran Verbowski.
Say it again.
Jeran Verbowski.
Bahram.
Yes, I'm Bahram Dermatavician. I have a question for Murat and Miguel. This question was asked to me 10 years ago. I answered that question. The student of mine asked that question. Let me relay this question because it very well fits into the paper. So when we read the historiography on this period, 2018 to 1918 to 1922, different words are employed to describe what happened during these years. So one is independence struggle, independence movement, liberation movement, national resistance movement. So which is a more correct depiction, a conceptual framing of this period, and which concept better relays, better describes the development on the ground? So it sounds, it's not a mere semantics, there is more into it. So if you could explain. Second one, Armin, it's an interesting topic. And my question is more of a comment. I think more work needs to be done also to understand the divide between Turkish and Armenian and Russian Armenians. There is this entrenched belief that there's so much that Armenian intellectual elite in Tiflis or in Russia understood very well what was going on among Turkish Armenians, which was not true. If you read Armenian newspapers from the late 19th century all the way to the beginning of the 20th century, you see that there is so much self-criticism that Russian Armenians are saying that it's a terra incognita, Turkish Armenia for us. We don't know how our brothers and sisters are living. And from there, when you link this to your article, you see that it's sort of a big idea that is just thrown out there by a Russian, and then with the hope that it can become another consolidating factor for Turkish Armenians or Russian Armenians to participate in the discussion. Keith, 2 years ago, Lerna Ekmekçioğlu wrote a fascinating paper about Armenian death matter. And she was basically talking how she built her argument about MIT and slavery, this course that was offered. And she was basically saying that this movement, Black Lives Matter, can be applied to the Armenian death matter for those Turkish universities which are built on the former. So how can this indigenous property and aspect can apply in your research? And Omid, I think this history of Memorial gives a fascinating aspect of the genocide and violence from the implementer's perspective. So how unique was Memorial? How many former technocrats, genocide technocrats, went ahead and published memoirs? Just the scope of this step, because you also describe him like you cite Browning saying that this guy was an ordinary man. Was he really ordinary? I mean, by no stretch of imagination, he was a successful. He had a successful career in the system. He did whatever the system was expected of him. And are there any other such memoirs published by former doers of the system? Thank you.
Thank you. And I have a comment and maybe question to Manuk. Thank you for this article. I think I like it. I find it very fascinating. I'm working on this land issue, and I'm going to your last comment about the Jewish settlement trust, the Afghanistan trust. I think you can maybe go in detail about how you can compare with this activity or the opening of National Bank and the Jewish trust and maybe the other cases, because I remember from reading, especially competition between Germany, Prussia, and Poland in terms of their settlement issues in the Poland, because they also established a bank called Land Bank. Actually, they both, because Germany established this bank to settle German settlers in the Poland, whereas Poland also established their land bank. They called land bank to again improve their, the fight against the German settlement attempts. So maybe looking at this, especially a global trend. So in related to this, maybe can you tell about whether there's also this land dimension about behind the opening of this bank? Because you said that they're planning to lending some credit to Armenian peasants, but maybe they also include some scheme to, keep Armenian peasants, to let Armenian peasants keep their lands. But maybe if the idea, and it's also interesting that the Turkish government especially found this opening of the bank in a positive way, because I didn't understand, because during that time they actually trying to prevent Armenians from getting their lands through the General Inspectorate that would be established by the Reform Act. So maybe they wanted to use this bank to compensate Armenian peasants so that they wouldn't have to return this bank. Maybe it's interesting question.
You're all too modest. This is Mehmet Polatel. He doesn't want to tell his name.
Nice.
So
And-
give the microphone back.
Sorry.
Once you're done.
No, yeah, I'm done with my newspaper, and I have a question for Özüksel and Göçek. I just curious about the resistance, the local resistance and aging part. They really resisted until 1920-21 against the observation of into the national unity. They didn't want to be part of the national unity until very late. So what is the reason that they didn't want to be part of this issue? I didn't really. I just curious about it's the ideological way, or as you said, they kind of the democratic structure and they wanted to continue this structure. And I think I'm.
It's right now.
Okay. And we start with you. Okay.
So, what to call it? Independence struggle, independence war. Of course, it is very political, which term you use. In the Turkish context, the official context, they want to see it as a war. And they want to sort of pitch it as a war against Western powers. I mean, so that seems to be sort of symbolically what they want to use it for at the moment. But when you look at it, the sort of the documentation and the sort of what is going on at the time in the aftermath of World War I, they are, of course, they are not as interested in what the Western powers are doing, because even if they came and colonized, they know that it would be for a while, and then there would be another system established. I mean, according to the Sèvres Treaty, that there would be an Armenian and a Kurdish state and a small Turkish state as such. So that obviously is sort of the first image when and that is technically the image also that the Ottoman Empire or the Sultan advocates, because he is the one who's going to execute this according to the agreement. But what that, of course, throws a spin is when Union and Progress literally gets together and then nominates and sends Mustafa Kemal on purpose with a big retinue of 72 people, and most of whom are soldiers, with the exception of a couple. So I have a list of all the people, who he was with. Of course, with this speech, it's as if he went by himself and he took everything himself. He didn't. I mean, there was a huge group of people with him. When he goes there, they are all dressed in sort of Ottoman uniforms, him included. But it's interesting that when he goes, of course, to the Erzurum Congress, he is dressed again in his military uniform. Feyzi Çakmak says, no, you have to take that off because you are here as sort of as the leader, I mean, not as the Sultan's representative, but as the leader of this new independence movement. So there you see a shift. I mean, that is where the sort of the political ambiguity sets in, because when you do that, this is no longer a war fought by an Ottoman general on behalf of the Sultan to sort of settle things there, to make sure that this doesn't develop into a war against the West, is basically what he's doing. But then you could argue that when he goes and becomes this civilian, later on, of course, again, puts on the garb of the National Assembly. So that's different. But in that process, I think it's a struggle. I would say it is a struggle, and their priority, I mean, part of the reason why it's in Erzurum and then Sivas is these are also places, where there have been a lot of plunder of Armenian properties. They are taken on by the local, mostly Muslim, Turkish and Kurdish notables. And they do not obviously want to give these up. I mean, so that is the primary reason why the local, resistance starts in the east. That is where, I mean, Vilayet-i Sitte, that is where, of course, the Armenian and the Kurdish things are. So because of that, I would say it is a struggle. But they, of course, once the Turkish Republic is then established, I mean, after the assembly and such, then they want to see it sort of officially as a war, to give it more stature than it's being only against the minorities, or it being literally a civil war almost, as they fight against the Armenian and Greek resistors, such as there were in the East. So that's why I think there's an ambiguity, because it means different things politically depending on when you're looking at it. At the moment, Mustafa Kemal arrives in Samsun, what he does in Erzurum and Sivas, and then what he does later on once he establishes in Ankara the National Assembly, right? I mean, so that's, I think, why there is ambiguity of meaning. And you were asking about
local resistance. What is the reason behind their resistance to not absorb into the national unity?
Well, I mean, at the moment, if you look at it, this is also a time of great ambiguity. One of the reasons, for example, İsmet Pasha, İsmet İnönü, who is the head of the Teşkilat-ı Mahsusa, by the way, and also he holds the money for the Union and Progress, the örtülü ödenek, as they call it. He stays in Istanbul. He argues that he does it because he's just married and, wants to live with his wife and all that, which is very nice and romantic. But the main reason is that he still thinks there is the option of a British protectorate. Then, of course, there is the possibility of an American mandate. So there are all these different possibilities as to what could be done in the provinces. It's because of that, I think, that they are not yet settled as to, how things are going to go. Do they want to throw their lot in with the Allied forces, or what they may be doing eventually? Or will they go with Mustafa Kemal and, all the others who are now taking, literally a risky stand for independence? So that I think is why the ones in the East who start these movements initially, and again, these are areas where there was a lot of, the Vilayet-i Sitte area. It depends on, how things are going in those parts, and that's why they stay local and they wait to see how things are going to work out. Feyzi Çakmak, for example, writes about how he's ready, and the military contingent he controls is in good shape, but he stays in the East when he wants to go to the West and fight alongside İsmet İnönü and others. Mustafa Kemal says, no, you stay in the East and, guard the East. And he says, well, they do it because they want to take the credits for leading the independence war and sideline me. So there are also those things, Enver is also trying at the moment to come to the East, via Russia, to join the independence movement, which he cannot. So I think that is why there is so much indeterminacy at the time, because people do not know yet who to throw their lots in with. And they have to wait, and it's after when the independence armies start to gain, successes, victories, that is when they sort of start joining after the congresses. Yes.
I'm more of a Southern autonomous.
Okay. Southern. Oh,
But
okay.
every time, whenever I look at the war for independence, right, so I'm looking at it from sort of Syria.
Mhm.
To me, it looks more like the Anatolian Civil War than right?
Yeah,
That's
yes,
what it looks
yes,
like
yes.
to me.
Yeah.
Right, so it looks more like a civil war.
Mhm.
And so I've often wondered that one of the ways to really disrupt the Kemalist narrative,
Mhm.
right? And the denialist narrative simultaneously, right? Is to resituate this within the framework of civil war.
Mhm.
And so it's a fierce rejection of the independence
Mhm.
narrative, right? But then you begin, these other wars that are part of it begin to make a little bit more sense,
Mhm.
right? And certainly the anti-colonialist dimensions of it begin to make a little bit more sense. So I just, those of you young people working on that period, I think I would encourage you to think about sort of thinking in terms of civil war.
The issue there is it would be a civil war, but this is also the transition from an empire to the nation
Right,
state,
so there's part of
from
that.
subject to citizenship, so that these people, I mean, the minorities, especially Greeks, Assyrians, and mostly Armenians, are not sort of defined as nations yet, or not in the sort of nation state formation. They basically are defeated before they're able to establish according to the Sevres Treaty, the Armenian state
But
as such.
this would be a way but if you reapproach it as civil war,
Yeah,
then things like the Marash resistance and
Yes.
so on,
it makes more sense.
more sense.
Yeah.
Actually,
Right.
just to follow this up,
Mhm.
I
Yes.
spent all
Yes,
my
do.
September in Greek archives.
Yeah.
So I specifically look at this particular time period, the Greek occupation of
Right.
every single province and district in Western Anatolia. Not only civil war, we can talk about multiple civil wars.
Right.
Yeah, there's that one.
And no direct rule control, even there were conflicts among the Muslims, civilians, and they even went to and applied to Greek occupation forces to resolve their problems for that. I mean, there is a lot to study and unpack this time period. Not only civil war, I can easily say by probing these documents very haphazardly, there were civil wars. Yeah.
That's how
Yeah.
Jonathan Smealy, who's worked on Russian history, has recast their understanding of the Russian Civil War by calling his book Russian Civil Wars and beginning, I think, in 1916 and going up to 1926 as well. So that might be
Getting toward the end here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And some of us would like to make a comment, so.
Okay.
I think you're referring to.
So what do you want me to do? I mean, I'm
Shall I?
not gonna do anything.
No, you're in charge. I just would like to have some time to make it.
Okay,
Sure.
that sounds great.
Just 2 minutes. I want to address the Gottfried question. So, yes, Albert, what is it? Albert Speer, yeah, would be Speer. Also Werner Best. So I also look at the Werner Best in the book as well. I'm specifically trying to find out the statisticians and also engineers, especially. That's why I'm now reading this famous books by Michael Kotz about the Nazi bureaucrats and so forth, regarding how he engages with his own memoir. He was pretty selective. In some pages, he was so apologetic, like in the memoir Halil Menteşe, for instance. So except and in certain parts he was very defensive, and in certain parts he was very, very reactionary. So he had this complicated feelings in terms of approaching the events, the set of events as well. And how unique was Vimaroğlu? He's not unique at all, I would say. He's not ordinary. His actions and political deeds were ordinary, actually. This is what makes him ordinary in that sense. Because in this kind of organizational structure, very Weberian, and he's not acting in a Weberian iron cage in that sense. He knew what he was doing, and he was very, very conscientious about it. Are there any other memoirs like him? haven't encounter any other memoir as within this content and form and shape. But there is one memoir by Abidin Şefik Özdemir and Necmettin Zahir Sılan. These two memoirs also, they were Ottoman bureaucrats, and then they also play a key role in the state bureaucratic apparatus of the early Turkish Republic. And they mostly dealt with the Eastern question, and especially the Dersim issue. Their reports were meticulously and cautiously taken into account by the political decision makers.
You want to say a little bit about
a couple things.
indigeneity, and
Sure.
then we move to Ron?
That's what I'm gonna ask about.
So,
You want to ask it before he goes?
No, I'll let him go
Okay.
first and then I'll attack. I will comment.
so to answer Jeden's question, I'm not concerned about the use of the term indigeneity. At all. I don't speak for the Indigenous Studies community. I don't speak for Native American studies, but I did share in the article a definition of indigeneity that was developed by Indigenous communities in the drafting process of the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, which is a global consensual definition of what indigeneity is. And it is about connection to place, but it's also about a sense of a passing down of cultural knowledge and identity that even transcends diaspora. One of the truisms that all Indigenous people share is that they are usually disconnected from place. They're disconnected from their place. What concerns me more is when perpetrator communities deny the indigeneity of Indigenous people and become very uncomfortable with the use of the term Indigenous. So whereas we're very comfortable with using the term Indigenous for North American Native people, Alaskans, Hawaiians, we're very comfortable with that in the Antipodes. We become more uncomfortable with it, especially liberal intellectuals in Turkey, for Armenians and Assyrians and Kurds, the Sami in Scandinavia, the Palestinians when you're in regards to Israel. So that's what concerns me a lot more, is that when raising objections to the use of indigeneity is actually a fairly not so obvious tool to actually continue to deny the rights of Indigenous people, right? Because this also points to an important other idea, which is that colonial settler states tend to provide the dominant definition of what an Indigenous person is. They catalog them. Blood quanta is one of the best examples in the United States, right? So that's what concerns me. That's what concerns me about it. I think there's another part of your question. Do you remember there's another part? Oh, Bahrambe, he asked a question. So Baron Bahram asked a question. So I'm in a field where we're trying to connect sort of disciplinary knowledge with rights claims, right? So we're always sort of looking for ways that we can support that. And that makes what I do a little bit different from just being a traditional historian. And so the international treaties, United Nations declarations do paint a picture of what a just restitution or just return process would look like for Indigenous people, right? There's a process of recognition of claims, of acknowledgement of shared responsibility for holy sites or for important religious or cultural sites. But in other words, there is a process that has been emerging over the last 2 decades built around this indigeneity. So one of the things, let me just finish this one point. I was talking with Carla Garapetian last week in LA, and she said that they were doing these surveys of Armenians, and they didn't like to be called Indigenous because it was connecting them with Native Americans.
Wow.
And, I mean, Mark Arax writes about this in Fresno too. We've been talking a lot about this, and where Armenians are actually referred to pejoratively as a kind of Indian, right? You remember this from
Fresno.
Yeah, the Fresno Indians, right? Yeah. And so I think that that's if anyone were to ask me, I think that the use of the term indigenous within political and diplomatic circles as applied to the Karabakh Armenians is utterly and completely appropriate. Absolutely. And in fact, what happened to them is what happens to Indigenous people. They're in the way. They're in the way of modernization, they're in the way of industrialization, they're in the way of national identity. They're just in the way. And so you want to get rid of them, either with carceral humanitarianism or with ethnic cleansing or with genocide, right? So I think that from a stance that we as historians and others can take is sort of, I'm just not so worried, about indigeneity as a concept. I think it's really becoming more solidified. It's working, but what I encourage people to do is to see how it can play a role in making rights and justice claims. And I think it can, and it should. No, let me say it this way: it must be used in the case of the Cote d'Ivoire Armenians. It must be used. Yeah, it must be used. Yeah.
I want to start by saying what a wonderful panel this was. Extraordinary. And thank you, Melanie, for being such a great chair. Yes. And we have set a really good pattern. And I will say this, that before this conference started, I thought, I will never again edit any volume. And I still hold to that. I will never again edit any volume. But there is a volume here. These papers are so good that there's possibilities of working on that. But we'll leave that to the end. What I'd like to do in my remark questions, we might not have time to answer them, but remark questions, and we can pick up these themes later, is give some general points that I think were brought out here. First of all, with Armen, I remember trying to write this book on the genocide, that I came across a notion that I was surprised by, that I found that Armenians, many Armenians, and to some extent, some of them like Grigor Zorab were a model of this, and maybe an extreme and not typical, but I was thinking, they're Ottomans, and they want to be Ottomans, and they want to work within this. Murat and I were talking about doing an article, which I think he's still working on, about Karakin Pastormajan, Armen Garo, Ottoman Bank, right? Leads volunteers during World War I against the Ottomans. Before 1914, he's thinking of plans of engineering and modernizing Turkey as an Ottoman. So I was trying to find evidence for this, and one of the things I used, and someone had written a wonderful paper on this, was Armeno-Turkish, right? Okay. But here's an example of it, is that people were thinking, some were building businesses. Someone mentioned that in one of the papers. Someone was thinking of this bank, right? And it was that maybe we can live within this empire. A little more autonomy, perhaps, some rights, some guarantees from abroad, but we can live like that. And that wouldn't be unlike Palestinians if there were a one-state solution or something like that. Clearly, it didn't happen in the case of the Artsakh Armenians. So that's one thing. When Murat and Müge's paper, I was thinking how important it is to have a state. How important. So people are desiring a state, not just for emotional reasons or because it's in the air or something, or it's a discursive way of organizing yourself, but because it gives you power. It will protect who holds the land at that particular time, right? And Palestinians know this because when the British were there in the Mandate period, they tended to favor the Jews enough times that, in fact, the Arabs kept getting hurt by that. And of course, once Israel was formed, well, we know the consequence of that. You wonder today if indeed Israel is in any way redeemable. So it legit, and if you have a state, you legitimize the genocide. It's done. It's over. Umit, I like this paper so much, and I think you're on the ground there. But I very much appreciated Melanie and Keith and others' suggestions. For instance, Eichmann. Who's Eichmann? Hannah Arendt Eichmann? There's now a whole critique of Hannah Arendt Eichmann. Yeah, so it's interesting that Eichmann himself is a construction in a way, right? He was something, but that. And I wonder if Ian Kershaw's idea of working toward Talat might not be a more interesting way of framing that. This is just a suggestion. Armenian genocide studies, of course, and we all suffer from this, needs to liberate itself from the template of the Holocaust, right? It is not true. And this is a very good point that Dirk Moses makes in his rather controversial book, which I happen to like, and everybody else seems to hate, on permanent security. We'll talk more about that as we go forward. But the idea that in the Holocaust, Jews were innocent, right? What were Jews? Are they guilty of owning department stores? I mean, what's the point? Why not bicycle makers, someone said, or something like that. Armenians were not innocent victims. They were more than innocent victims. They were innocent victims too. They were also agents. And I tried to get that into the book as well. That is, they had revolutionary movements. They participated in parliaments. They wanted autonomy. And they also wanted to work within the Ottoman Empire. So they were caught in a dilemma. It's interesting that Dashnak Suchun isn't so happy with the history of its party within the Ottoman Empire, where they collaborated with the Young Turks right up to 1913, right? So this is a problem. And finally, Keith, I accept immediately the importance of this concept of indigeneity. But let's remember, indigeneity is not an ontological reality. It's a claim. And I think Jiden said this very eloquently. It exists within certain sanctioned discourses. If you were there first, somehow, this is completely discursive. If you were there first, you have certain claims that others who came later don't have. And who's indigenous in Anatolia? The Armenians, because they were there first? Well, the Turks have been there for 500 years or more. When do you get to be indigenous? Okay, not last Thursday, but still, you know, after 500 years, maybe you're also indigenous. And by the way, the Armenians were invaders of Western Anatolia in ancient times. So maybe we have to find, which the Turks claim to be, Hittites. They're really Hittites, you see. So they made an indigenous claim because they, in a sense, realized, oh, we actually came from Central Asia. So I think that we have to worry about this idea of a colonial, settler colonial state, which is a very powerful thing, works in Palestine, and so on. Indigeneity, as you pointed out, works in Artsakh. But in Anatolia, I'm more suspicious of this. And again, I just want to thank you all for these incredible papers.
Thank you.
Okay.